I'll put it over to these two great people over here. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jessica Thompson. I'm the owner of Green Goddess Gardens. We're a landscape company up in Ojai. This is my accomplice, Natasha Elliott, and we're here today. Well, I'll just let you know, I'm a contractor, landscape contractor. Our company is a full-service company, so we do design, installation, and maintenance. I have studied a little bit about permaculture, got a design certificate in permaculture, and I've studied soil biology with Inu. So I'll pass this on to Natasha.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I do landscape design for Green Goddess, and I have also a background in permaculture and some experience with habitat restoration, and really concentrated on designing landscapes that are sustainable. And part of that is making them fireproof. As we know, that's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. So.
All right, so the object of our talk today is to address fire hazards in the home and landscape and how to lower the chances of your home catching on fire. So has anyone here today lost their home or their landscape? So, wow. So would you mind sharing a little bit about what's happened with your space?
Our landscape is in the backyard. It's big. We have a hill. We have seen locals on it. It's basically front because it's on.
And is the hill behind the house going up or going down? Right. And how are your neighbors' homes?
They're all, everything burned except our neighbor across the street.
And where are you located? And how about you? So sorry to hear that. But I'm glad you're here, and hopefully your next house and garden that you are able to put in there is going to be able to be a little bit safer. You can protect it a little bit better. Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing, is that there's nothing that won't burn. So the thing though is if you can plan and plant strategically, then hopefully you'll be able to,
Increase your
chances.
Increase your chances. Increase your chances of. Yes. Hopefully, what we can do today is give you some ideas to how to move forward to build a more resilient home here now.
All right, so the factors of creating a safe landscape are, number one, house placement, how your house is placed in your property. And number two is construction materials of the house. Number three is creating the landscape zones. And number four, maintaining the fire-safe landscape.
So here we have a chart. A lot of people obviously don't have a choice where their plot of land is that they're going to be building. And, around here there's not so many plots, so we take what we can get. But this chart kind of shows the way air flows. So these are arrows represent wind, and where wind flows is where fire flows. So as you can see up canyons, how the air eddies and goes over them. So a good place to put your house is not at the top of your property, because that's obviously everything goes up. but then also not like in the canyon. So a good level part that's kind of in the middle, like here, tends to be a good zone. Anything to add to that?
Just be aware of how the wind blows in your yard. Which direction does it come? Either way. Normal way, which would usually be from south to north, kind of southwest to southeast, and then Santa Ana's, which is the reverse, which is coming from the desert toward our cool oceans.
Which are the winds that tend to generate the most fire. A good way to see the way wind is moving on your property is to look at where leaves are cooling, because that's wind bringing them there. So then you know if there was fire in that wind, where it would kind of take the fire.
Right. So next photo or picture. Is setbacks, and that's the location of the house. How far is the house from a slope, a ridge? I mean, this is a picture of homes and a cul-de-sac, and this is a ridge coming up to the house. And this is showing backyard lots with walls and fences and native plant material or plant material that's down below.
One of the big things that also, again, you don't maybe have so much control over, but hopefully we can all work together, is neighborhood layouts that leave for a lot better escapes. Like this design is very common, especially in subdivisions. But if you can try to make it so that access is better, that obviously helps with the firefighters and also
Right.
escape.
Yeah, and the fire trucks make sure that there is space. There's a lot of, like in Montecito, the roadways are so very narrow, and for a fire truck, even in Ojai, this happened in the canyons, firemen would not go into those residences because there was no way out, and they were very narrow roads, and so the residents there were the ones who saved their own homes. Very scary. So also having your address clearly marked on the house so they know exactly where they are, who is there, turnaround for a fire truck, the clearance for a fire truck, which is 12 feet wide at least by 15 feet tall. So if you've got a lot of big trees that are overhanging where the roadways where fire trucks would go would be at least 15 foot high. Would be a good thing. Number two is the construction of the home. You think about what is your home, the exterior of your home built with. Most homes here in Southern California are wood, and the exteriors, vary from wood siding to stucco. So the best thing to have on the sides of your home, especially on the windward side, is some non-flammable material. You can make sure, which would be something like stone or plaster.
A good idea is to keep the lower part, if you wanted to do the lower part on stone, parts where like you might have plant material, that's what burns, is plant material. And we're going to go through some plants that have a less likelihood of burning, but also where you have plant materials where you want the most fire safe materials. So if you even do like a facade of stone or brick or something on the bottom part of your house where the plant material would be, that really helps. I had a rodent problem at my house, and I had an exterminator come because they knew how to see like a mouse. They've learned to see like a mouse. So they were able to patch up all the little spots. So what you need to try to do is learn to see like fire and see where fire would run, and then come at your house. And once it's almost like putting on goggles. If you can put your fire goggles on and see where that fire runs, then it starts to become obvious. Oh, these are these are the problems. So, what does fire need? Fire needs fuel and it needs air. So anywhere where you're providing and a lack of wind. So anywhere where you can provide, where there's air and fuel underneath and it can smolder, that's when you can get the combustion that goes. So the boxed eaves are important so that little embers can't get caught under there and have that time to smolder and then eventually combust. Also patios, places like that where little embers can come. Also your vents are another place where fire can get in. So all of those areas, be aware of them and try to minimize them, but then also using a meshing less than 1/8 covers them, and that really can block those embers that are eventually going to get it combust. Because you've seen pictures of houses that are just in the middle of nowhere and they still combust because those embers fly. So later we'll go on to defensible space, but even if you create the defensible space, these embers, as you see examples, fly very far.
They say in a storm that embers can fly a mile away. And so making sure that, number one, your roof is made of a non-combustible material. You could have concrete tile, you can have a metal roof, you can have adobe tile, something that just doesn't allow to have little holes, although the adobe tile can have holes, but as long as those holes are filled, that the embers cannot get into those little cracks and smolder and catch that paper that's underneath them on fire.
So a lot of times you'll see on the adobe roof there's like little plugs of concrete plugging up those spaces. Those are all the little spaces that give an opportunity to fire to really grab hold.
So using this 1/8-inch screen, you can fill all your vents to the house. Also making sure, sometimes, we never know when a fire is going to come or how it's going to come. Let's say you're away from the house and you've left your window open and you don't have a screen on the window. You're just letting the air come through, but if there's a screen on that window, that's going to stop embers from coming into the house. So a common thing that's happening right now in construction is that they are boxing in the eaves, like Natasha had mentioned, and I've seen that on a few houses where that has worked really well in keeping fire from coming up and igniting those eaves on the bottom.
So that's the same if you're building arbors or pergolas, where you can't box it to use fire retardant materials.
Right. Also shutters, if you've got wooden shutters, those can be a problem, but if you've got a different kind of shutter, maybe a metal shutter, then that you can close those in an event of a really bad fire, and that way it'll help protect your windows from shattering and breaking. Also, outside. And if you've got plate glass windows, those will pop and break under a low intensity of heat. So it's good to have double pane windows. Make sure that you've got those. And also the sills around your windows, make sure they're not wood and that somehow, a different kind of metal would be better, because that seems to have another entry point where fire will sit and burn and start everything again. One of the bad things, just like what happened in your house, is fencing. How do you fence in your property when everybody's using wooden fences all the way around? And my dad lives above Ventura College, and the neighbor, there was an ember that flew from the hills and it touched on her house. That's the only house in the neighborhood that burned, right next door to where my folks live. And the bushes on the side of the house caught fire. Of course, everybody's homes are built so closely together. There's only 5 to 8 feet between the fence line and the house, and all the bushes along that house caught fire. Then the fence line caught fire, and it went all the way around, and all the fencing in behind my dad's and his two neighbors and the one behind him, it just burned all the way down and followed it. And so if there was a block wall instead, or if there was chain link or metal fencing, wrought iron fencing, those are the kinds of things that really should be built from here on out with homes that are that close to the fire zone, an area where the wildfires do come in with such intensity and size. So
Also, if you are going to use wooden fencing further out from your house, definitely don't have them coming up right to your house, because that's just a wick for fire to come to your house. But if you are, for example, on the pictures, do use wooden fencing, having concrete underneath it helps, because the fire often comes from below. So it's the same if you're using concrete walls, like as partitions between you and your neighbor's house, and you put a concrete wall. It's not completely ideal, but if you wanted like some privacy screening, to put a tree and have the canopy up higher is better than having just hedges. Again, as we'll go into the zones, you'll see that that's still not ideally recommended, but it's better.
okay, so
Is it better to have chain link with like a line on it versus a fence, or both are bad?
A vine is really problematic, because vines tend to generate a lot of dead plant material, which is
right, it depends upon what you're going to be growing. Does it produce a lot of debris? Right. Yeah, and the trumpet vine tends to carry a little more water, so that could actually slow down some of the fire. But again, how close is it to the house?
I mean, any plant material that starts to go in next to the house is problematic. I mean, ideally, you don't have any plant material touching your structure, because even as much water as a plant can hold, fire goes and it dries out everything in front of it, and then it ignites it, and that's how it's able to move so fast. So even completely wet, I mean, of course, irrigating, keeping everything properly irrigated, but we'll get into that more.
I was asking whether
The question was whether we'd recommend planting vines up like a chain link fence. That was the question.
because a lot of us have hills in our yards, and in order to put up a block wall that requires a retaining wall, which would be a foundation, which would be really big.
Yes. It's a sad fact, but yes. Yeah, permitting and engineering, yeah, depends upon what you're doing back there. Yes, but if it's far enough away from the house, then doing a chain link fence would be perfect.
Would be better than
Yeah,
wood, or
then wood, absolutely, absolutely. It's just fuel, dried wood, waiting for a nice little ember. Right, and as long as that vine is far enough away, and if you know that a fire is coming, if you hear it, it's coming your direction, start irrigating, get everybody wet, get the soil wet, get your mulch wet, and that could be a good, again, a zone where things start burning slower and slower, and that'll give you or the fireman time to be able to get it out before it reaches the house. All right, so zones. What are these zones we're talking about? This is what is recommended now for protecting the home. Zone number 1 is closest to the house. It's 0 to 30 feet away from the house. Most important zone. You need to grow low-growing plants, high water content holding type of plants, well-irrigated plants. I'm just going to finish my little spiel here, and then I'll let Natasha take over. Planting trees at least 15 feet from the roof line, and that's the canopy from the roof line, a mature canopy from the roof line. Leaving space for plants to fully grow and still not touch each other. So it's kind of an open, lessly planted zone, which is low. Go ahead.
So on the plant list that, and let me wait because of the feedback. We gave a plant list that lists some plants that work well in each of the zones, and so here's a few of the plants that they recommend. A lot of succulents hold a high amount of water, and things burn when they're dry. So as long as it takes all the water to leave that plant, the less likely it is to burn. So as you can see, these all have a lot of moisture. If we took a lighter to them, we'd cook them before we burn them. And then another thing is to keep plant material not just away from the house, but also 1.5 to 2 feet away from any of the windows. So, you know, it's really common to see, and it's pretty to have like plants in front of the windows in front of the house, but you kind of need to rethink how we do that, keeping everything closely pruned and just keeping a really close eye, especially to zone 1, which if any of you have any experience with permaculture, it's a similar idea. It's a much easier space to maintain because it's a lot closer and you see it a lot more, so it is also kind of easier. As you're coming in and out of your house, you'll notice if there's dead plant material that needs trimming. But it's preferable to use plants that requires little maintenance in terms of taking off dead plant material. So again, the succulents.
Yes, and in Ventura, that's a perfect place to plant. All right, zone 2 is 20 to 50 feet from the house. This is the green belt. Maintain relatively an open character in the zone, provide irrigation to the plants, plant low-growing ground covers with medium shrubs mixed within. Succulents are an excellent choice. Trees should be planted so canopies are not touching. So again, this is just a zone a little bit further away from the house. This is where you can start incorporating some mixture of succulents and, let's say, sages. Start bringing in a little bit more plant material that'll give you more color and flower, but yet do not have a high fuel production in them. And this is actually where you're going to be maintaining more often instead of in the outer zones, just to make sure that that extra fuel, which is dead material, is cleaned. You can mulch in this area. Fires come just once every blue moon, and what we do need to do is not to forget that we've got to keep our soils healthy in the meantime and keep our plant material healthy. When your plants are nice and green and holding a lot of water, then they're less of a fire hazard. So that's, and keeping mulch on the ground will help keep the moisture in the soil longer, hydrating your plants, keeping everybody nice and healthy.
Yep. Healthy plant material will have less dead material on it, less desiccated material there for healthy. So just keeping a healthy garden, well-maintained garden in general goes a long way to fire safety.
Right, and that's what happened in a lot of gardens, is that the mulch, and did you have wood chips? Did you have mulch? Did you have wood chips, or did you have like a fine grind? It's just a layer of, you had big chunks of redwood, right? So, usually when what I've experienced in talking to a lot of people out in areas that did get burned pretty heavily, they talked also about how the fire traveled that got into the mulch and then spread and kept popping up and slowly smoldering as time went on, and they had to open up that mulch and to tap the fires out. So if you know that it's coming, that it might be, again, it's in your zones. If you can plan your garden to have these zones that are a little bit further away from the house, then hopefully you can manage that mulch when the fire's coming, and that would be by getting it wet, getting it really wet before the fire reaches your place. So it's all timing, and I know that during our fire we had incredibly low humidity level, and everything dried out. We had 1 to 3% humidity. Everything was suffering. So it's hard to say, but as far as mulching goes, I personally feel that because fires come so rarely, it is more important to keep your soils healthy and hydrated by keeping that mulch layer over it, keeping your soil biology really healthy and strong, that way creating your plant material to be healthy and strong, and again, being hydrated much more. So, if you have anything more?
Yeah, I mean, that's the tricky thing about mulch. It's really, really one of the best things you can put in your garden. It does have that potential to burn, but I just think keeping it wet, I mean, and then maybe not put it right in front of your house in that first zone, but keeping it out in the zone. Because another thing that happens in that second zone out is you do want a little bit bigger plant material. It's where you start incorporating some trees, because the tree, a well-hydrated tree can actually save your house because it can catch the embers and then it just ends there. Whereas if there's nothing, it can the embers just fly into your house. So you don't want trees that are too tall, like big palms and stuff that also tend to have a lot of dry. Those are really bad. You catch them. But something like a medium-sized oak that's healthy and well-hydrated can actually work to save your house. Another thing in zone 2 is having that open space. So you want to keep your shrubs 2 times lower than your canopy height, because the fire does travel up, and if it kind of smolders in a bush, a lot of the water in a tree is held in the trunk. So if you can keep the flames in those lower shrubs near that well-hydrated trunk, you're going to have better luck than if it's up and is allowed to start getting some of those leaves that'll dry out a lot faster.
So maintenance in this whole landscape is extremely important. Making sure that you've collected your dead material, that you do bring that dead material back as mulch, or keeping it as mulch to keep your soils healthy, but then again, having it in a place where it's a little bit further away from the house where you can manage it if something does come. If the fire does get on the mulch, then you can go ahead and open that up and make sure that you can wash it down or beat it out.
If you're really concerned about fire, if you're in a very high likelihood place of it burning again, if you have a swimming pool, getting a pump that you could put in there, or putting even a water tank so that you can have access to that water, because if a fire is coming, the best thing that you could do is just keep everything as wet as possible. And as a lot of you know, water pressure drops when everybody's trying to do that. So
a gas-powered generator pump is with a long hose that you can reach your whole landscape with is highly recommended. All right, zone 3 is 50 to 60 feet from the house. This should consist of low-growing and woody plants, natives, Mediterranean mixes that require periodic irrigation, maintain spacing in between individual plants or clusters of plants. So again, we're going into a denser part of the landscape. Things are getting a little more wild, but it's not like you're not paying attention to that zone. And there's not too many of us here that have landscapes that are yards that are 60 feet wide all the way around the house. So if you're one of those, you're lucky.
well, as we see, that urban wilderness interface is probably the most fire prone area, and so when we start looking at going beyond our houses, again, on like a city planning level, need to start thinking about what's there, and if trying to just encourage healthy native habitats are also going to work a lot better with fire. I don't know if you want to go into the ecology of fire now. Okay, so a lot of people say, "Oh, controlled burns help. Let's get less material to plant." Well, and our ecosystem is fire dependent. Well, this is true. There is a lot of plants that only reseed when fire comes. But in nature, the only source of fire is lightning. And if you look at how often lightning ignites natural landscapes, pre-human times, is like 30 to 150 years. So it's supposed to go for a while. And what happens with the controlled burn is it gives opportunity for a lot of invasive plants to come in that tend to be a lot more flammable. So just caring and stewarding for the land beyond can help minimize the intensity of these wildfires that are cropping up. So if you can try to put, especially a big thing that's happening is, as I was saying, some of these plants, seeds only resprout with fire. But you give them 30 years and they get this time to rebuild the seeds, their seed banks in soil, rebirth the seed banks in the soil. So when the fire comes, they do resprout and you can get a native landscape back. Some of these fire intervals that are happening around here are way more frequent, and there is a problem with the native seed banks becoming somewhat decimated. So if you do have a large property and you're going out, it is a really good idea to put some of these natives, to give them more opportunity of those taking over than highly fuel-filled invasive.
Which is a lot of grasses or invasive weeds. So that's the fear of what could be happening with a lot of our habitat here in the Los Padres National Forest, is that it has burned in some locations less than 30-year intervals. So we'll see. We know that our landscape is changing. It is, Southern California is getting drier, and the chaparral is slowly receding, and the rest of our country is getting drier. So, but that'll take hopefully many, many years. Stressing the importance of adding natives into our landscapes. There's a whole insects and animals that are dependent on natives, or native animals and insects that come from the hills here. They're able to live here year-round. They're dependent on when native plants flower, the nectar that they produce, and when there's a big swath of it that's gone, for us to be able to supplement our edges, our zones with native plants, then we're going to be helping everybody out, repopulating those areas as time goes on. Because more than likely, everything that did get burned up there is gone. The animals, the birds, the bugs, they're gone. So, yes. There are natives and there's Mediterraneans, and so yes.
They're not all native, but if you look towards the list in Zone 4, a lot of them are. So kind of more native as you go out
From the house, from the zones. Yes. The list that we gave you, it'll talk about those zones. You can go ahead and look at how far that slope is from the house. You can, right. So I would say something, a low-growing, something that retains the soil well, but yet is able to be a slow-burning plant material. And there's a lot of them. On the web, there's certain sites that have even more information than what we provided, but this list that we've given you are plants locally here that do really well.
Is this from the Nevada?
Yeah.
So there's another list which I can pass around. We didn't print it out, but this is from a slightly different area. This is from Nevada City. It's like foothills, but they have some plants that are good and not good, if you want to.
And lots of natives on this list.
Yeah, there is.
There's a website on there that you can take a photo of or write down so you guys can check it out on the web. All right, so zone 4 is 70 to 100 feet from the house. This is the transition area between the native landscape and your landscape. Maintaining the native vegetation has been thinned to reduce the plant volume, and again, kind of creating a little bit of space in between some plants, removing all the dead material, providing spacing. Any new plants should not require irrigation. So again, this would be treating as natives, planting natives in the fall, depending upon hopefully rainfall to bring them about. Or you're going to be walking around with a watering can. During a wildfire, this zone may burn, but with less fuel, it'll be a slower burning fire toward the home, and that's what we're trying to create, is just a slower burning fire instead of something that will move really quickly. Irrigation is really important in your landscape. If you have a chance to be able to create a clean slate with a new landscape, one of the main concerns right now, especially in Southern California, is water catchment. We highly recommend that you have the opportunity now to be able to look at your land and see where the contours of your land is, and trying to look at your roof line and seeing if you've got gutters or no gutters, and how does the water flow off the house. If you've got hardscape like driveways and pathways, how does the water come into your yard? How does it flow out of your yard? And if you can create little swales in the yard, contours in the ground, to be able to slow that water down, then that has a chance to be able to percolate deeper into the soil, which then again gives us that moisture bank for the rest of the year. So some of you may have maybe on hillsides where they're very steep, and they've put in these concrete channels to catch the water from everywhere. If you can open those things up and slow it down, add rocks to those channels that aren't going to move too quickly, then you can hopefully slow that water down and give it an opportunity to fan out into your garden, into your land, to be able to sink deeper into the soil.
Which is also where that mulch comes into play. That's a huge component to that. Mulch is incredibly good at slowing down water and helps sink it. So that mulch thing is a little bit tricky. It does burn, but it overall keeps your landscape so much healthier. And as we saw in Montecito, the second threat from fire is flooding. So the more people kind of can sink their rainwater into their land, it keeps it from gathering up the momentum and creating these storms of water. Again, you need to be conscious of that too, because you don't want to be sinking a bunch of water really close to your house, because that can create water damage in your house. So use some sense with that, but as much as you can keep it on your property, the better your property is going to do overall in floods or fires. Because rain is becoming more intense, less frequent and more intense, and that fuels these fires, and it's the way things are going.
A lot of the soil here in Ventura is very clayey, so everybody's got to start working on their soil structure. And the only way that you can change your soil structure is by using compost. And Green Thumb sells this, probably the best commercial compost that's on the market that's really viable, that is active, is Malibu compost. It costs a little bit more, but you don't need to add too much for it to actually start working on your soil. We cut our compost with an azalea mix, because it's an acidic soil mix. This is an organic company also. You only want to be using organic products from here on out on your landscape to try to keep the critical biology alive. And this is what's going to be protecting your plants, creating better soil structure if you have good soil structure on your land, then in those areas where your swales are, the water's going to be able to penetrate much deeper into the soils. Again, holding more water in that place around your home, feeding all your trees and your bushes as the summertime goes along, which means you'll be using less water to keep everybody hydrated. Yes. That's great. Then just keep adding both of these. Again, you might have sandy soil, but you've got, are you near the beach or no? Then you've got more of a silty soil, and which is great. Again,
Better.
yeah, it's even better. So adding this, again, is going to help that structure become more defined. Again, it was just because the organic matter here is food for the biology in this bag. If you have not been adding organic matter to your soils like we used to many years ago, and you've just been raking and blowing and raking and keeping everything all cleaned, then your soil structure probably, even though it's a silty soil, it probably repels water a little bit, but then it finally accepts a little bit of water. So you want that to accept water immediately. So any irrigation that you're putting out should be able to soak all of that up instead of having it pool up and you think, oh, I'm overwatering, it's standing, I'm going to only put 10 minutes of irrigation, of drip irrigation on, when actually you're only barely wetting the first couple of inches in the soil.
Who here takes probiotics? Kind of random question, or thinks about probiotics? This is pretty much probiotics for your landscape. What you're doing is adding microorganisms, and just as probiotics help your health, they also help your garden's health. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience of taking antibiotics and afterwards you start getting stomach problems and stuff because you killed your biology in yourself. That's what kind of happens when you use inorganic fertilizers. You're killing that biology, and that biology is what opens up your soil, allows it to hold water, and increases your plant health. It works to feed your plants, just how when you eat your food, if you have good biology, you get better nutrition. It's the same for plants.
Right. So a good way to see if you're irrigating enough is just this really simple tool. This is just a simple moisture meter. No batteries needed, and you can check and see, and you can go down fairly deep. It's good to stick it in the root zone to make sure that your irrigation is actually getting into where you need it to be. So after you do your composting, a layer of mulch on top of that, again to protect that live layer of soil and keeping it moister longer, cooler. Biology needs to have a little bit of shade, a little bit to stay a little cool, and they're going to hang out in your area a little bit longer. So even though we're talking about, plant material that burns slowly and, what else can we do, the bones of your landscape really is your water catchment to hold your water, the construction of that house that does not allow embers to blow in and sneak in, and while you think your house is safe and the fire has passed, there's something burning up in your attic or on the top of your roof. So, I don't know if I made any sense right there, but
So sprinklers on top of your, again, I talked about the diesel pumps for if you either get a water tank or if you have a pool, having sprinklers on your roof also.
yeah, it has been helpful. That has been helpful. Again, it's all about timing when you keep everything wet. In Australia, that's where they have their fire sprinklers. They don't have them inside the house. It's very rare that a firehouse starts anymore. It's all on the outside. And so now they have all their sprinklers on the outside. And, we've got windy conditions here. And so once that starts picking up, hopefully you can, watching everybody here, I think, in Ventura County is very aware about the humidity level and the Santa Ana winds, and when the Santa Ana winds come, the temperatures go up. And those are the three things, plus the fuel. Those are the four things that will create an out-of-control fire. So if you know that that's coming, you might turn your sprinklers on, if something is happening, if there's an action going on close to the house. Let me see. Right, so we may have mentioned already that wildfires do not start on their own except by lightning. And the only time we ever have lightning is usually in the wintertime. And that usually happens way up in the mountains. And so again, if the situation is right, then fires will be pushed down all the way down to the coast. But it's very rare in our winters that we have had Santa Ana winds, but this year was a completely different story. The only thing is that that fire was not caused by nature, it was caused by man. So
So here we are.
yeah.
Can I make a comment on mulch?
Yeah.
I know it's a big topic. I also work with Ocean Friendly Gardens with the Surfrider Foundation, and we also close a lot of gardens, and we've always said lots of mulch, but now we're really rethinking that, especially in fire zones. So we've had a lot of discussion about that recently. Also speaking with the University of California Extension, they have a really great website on firescaping, which has a lot of recommendations along the same zonation issues.
Richard
So
Flowers, ring 108.
our thoughts right now are that it's really important to keep some mulch on the soil, both for soil health, for the health of the plants, for insulation, but also to deal with the zonation issue. So maybe much less or even no mulch right next to the house, but then out in the garden you definitely need it. And the other issue with that is suppression of invasive weed seeds. It seems some people actually think it's more important to be dealing with that and using mulch to suppress those invasive grass seeds, which we know is actually a very invasive fire ladder. So to keep the weed seeds down is more important than the flammability of the mulch at a certain point.
Right,
So
and
I
that's
just wanted to address that. As
yeah,
well,
that's the
because
struggle
it's going
that
to be
I
a big
have.
issue, and I know people have mulch burn in their yards, but keeping it hydrated. When you put it in first, really wetting it down so that it actually closes down the air holes in the mulch. If it's fluffy mulch, it tends to be more flammable. If it's been on the soil for a while and it starts to break down, it actually is less flammable. And if it's wet and old mulch, it can almost be a fire suppressant. It will smolder rather than burn. So we're still dealing with this, but that is a really big question, and there aren't going to be more answers out there. And I would recommend looking at the UC website or asking these ladies who will all be talking about it for many years to come. The website again.
Yeah. Well,
The UC Extension, they have a fire safe landscaping website. They have a lot of
yeah. That is one good thing also about succulents is using succulent. Probably it's not a good idea to use wood mulch in zone 1. But if you look at the plants that we're recommending for zone 1 are a lot of succulents, and the good thing is that succulents do well with like the stone mulches. That's another option, is like the crushed rock, the stone mulches. Those might not work so well on some of the plants in zone 3, and because you want those like bigger, woodier plants that more closer. You're more closely replicating a forest type scenario, so you need more forest type conditions. And in a forest, you're going to have a lot of like organic leaf matter coming down. So those like wood, these tend to be a little bit more desert plants. And if you go to the desert, there's not a lot of that organic matter. So it tends to be a lot more like rock and stuff, native gravels. So these plants work really well with rock gravels. It's best to have something on your ground. Having bare soil is the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, and so usually you can, if you do have a beautiful plant that really has a little bit of wood in it, then you do need to put the mulch on around it, and you can just put it underneath that plant instead of having it, all over. So that's something I struggled with in the beginning too, because I'm, a soil believer, soil biology believer, and you got to cover everything with mulch and a nice thick layer of mulch, and so you're reducing your weed population and you're keeping that soil biology fed and healthy, and it's soft, and the soil just becomes more accepting of water. And here we are in this beginning of a 100-year drought, and we need to retain as much water as we possibly can. And so the idea of taking the mulch away is like, oh no, we're going to have all this, horrible ground, but again, as long as you have these zones where you're at and you address around the house, our landscaping is just going to be different than it has been in the last, 60, 70 years. We're not going to have those English gardens anymore. If we do, it's going to be in Zone 3, maybe parts of Zone 2 and Zone 3, where you still can have a lot of color, a lot of mass planting, but as long as you keep things nice and clean and irrigated and mulched, then it should be healthy, water holding, better. But the whole idea of having hedgerows real close to the house, right underneath the windows, marking your, pathways, it'll have to be creatively done if someone insists on that kind of landscape with maybe plants that look like it but are more succulent, more water holding.
Another good website is called Cal IPC, and that lists all the invasive plants. So as much as we can keep our native habitats native, that helps with all this soil retention, keeping invasives out, which tend to help grow fire.
All right, so are there any other questions?
IPC, I think it stands for Invasive Plant Council. I'm not sure about that, but I'm not sure if it's .com or .org, but if you type in Cal IPC, it'll say like plants, native plants, invasive plants, and there's a whole list. It says, explore the whole site if you find it interesting, but there's a place and it says A through Z, and it lists everything, and then it marks the level of how problematic it is, and the regions in which it's most problematic. It maps that.
Thanks for coming today, and hope we helped you.